So welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're calling in from. And thank you for joining today's webinar, The Quest for True Materiality. One thing to keep in mind, you are muted throughout the entirety of the conversation just to ensure good audio quality. But if you have any questions throughout, please do pop those questions into the Q&A box and we'll monitor those as they come through. For today, for the conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by some esteemed practitioners and thought leaders in the space. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to be talking about the quest for true materiality. How do you make it work for you? And really, the conversation is focusing on how do companies actually go about defining what is material for them in the context of environmental, social, and corporate governance issues or sustainability issues or non-financial issues. For today, we'll be referring to these issues as ESG or non-financial. What we see in the marketplace is that there are a variety of different types of definitions of materiality available from different types of standard setters, investors, risk managers, publicly industry bodies. So it's becoming a bit harder for companies to really determine the ultimate way that works for their business, one that is thorough, robust, but also efficient. So today we're really going to be focusing on how can you as a company reconcile the different definitions provided by these different frameworks and policymakers. For the conversation today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Andreas Hoepner, who is a member of the EU Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, also a professor of operational risk, banking and finance at the University College of Dublin. Lene Bjørn Serpa, head of organizational engagement and reporting for Maersk Sustainability. And Maersk is the world's largest container shipping company based out of Denmark. Also by Yen-Pei Chen, who is an integrated reporting subject matter expert at the ACCA, which is the global body for professional accountants. My name is Suzanne Cadis. I'm a VP of Business Development at Datamaran. Datamaran is a software as a service solution that supports companies with their materiality analyses as well as overall non-financial risk management strategy. So I already mentioned that you are muted as you come in. Next slide, please. But just some other quick housekeeping rules before we dive into the content. So in addition to being muted, you can engage with us through the Q&A box. Next slide, please. There we go, thank you. We are recording this webinar and we will send a recording to all participants. Please do feel free to engage with us through the Q&A, but also through social media. Here are some of the handles that you can use throughout. And if you have any questions from a technical standpoint in terms of using Zoom, please contact us at marketing@datamaran.com. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, the laptop is a bit slow on that side. No problem, I'll keep that in mind. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so for today's discussion, some of the key questions that we're going to be answering are really, what is the materiality determination process? And why is this becoming more and more at the forefront of defining corporate accountability? What are some of the must-haves in this process, according to business, according to standard setters and policymakers? Another question we'll also be talking about is it enough for companies to really follow one of the guiding frameworks? We'll also talk about what are some of those guiding frameworks. Or should you as a company really be mixing and matching those different frameworks, and in what proportions? Another question that we'll be addressing is how can you, within a company perspective, really not become a slave to the process of developing your own methodology? So how can you have a thorough yet efficient materiality process? Before we jump in and I hand it over to our esteemed speakers, just to set the stage, why does materiality matter? Next slide, please. So materiality really is a business process that helps companies define why and how certain issues are important for their company, for their sector. And materiality, issues that are deemed to be material for a company can have financial, economic, reputational, and human capital impacts. Materiality applies in a wide variety of different types of contexts. So traditionally, it comes from the accounting domain. It also applies to the reporting domain, business, financial, legal, risk, and more recently to the ESG or sustainability or non-financial issue domain. And that's the domain that we're going to be focusing on today. The materiality process is important for companies because really it provides insights into future trends and business risks and opportunities. It helps companies identify what's important to their different types of stakeholders. And it also helps them to engage internally with key stakeholders. Next slide, please. Over time, we've seen that there are a variety of different policymakers, regulators, institutions that have been influencing the way that we view materiality in the context of ESG or sustainability issues. So in this next slide, what you'll see is just a timeline of some of those policymakers and influencers that have been influencing the way we view materiality. So as a company, how can we reconcile the different expectations from these different types of stakeholders? I think the key takeaway when it comes to materiality and looking at these different types of definitions is that materiality really is flexible, it's time variant, and it's context driven in the context of ESG issues. Next slide, please. So taking into consideration that materiality is flexible, time variant, and context driven, what we're seeing more and more is that there is increasing scrutiny from investors and regulators on the processes that companies actually have in place to define their material issues. Next slide, please. So in this next slide, what you'll actually see is from a recent Datamoran study, which showcases that there's been an increase in the number of companies that are actually conducting a materiality assessment. In the United States, a lot of companies may refer to this process as an issues prioritization process. And we see that this is really a reaction to the growing attention that's being placed on these processes from different types of investors and regulators. All right. So now that we've set the stage, we'd actually like to turn it to you, to the attendees. We have a few polling questions that we'll ask you throughout the webinar. And the first poll is really, how many guiding frameworks do you use for your materiality assessment? You'll see your responses there on the stage. You can respond. It could be 1 framework, 2 to 3 frameworks, more, or perhaps you've even developed your own framework in-house. So we'll just give it about 30 seconds for you to respond. Okay, the polls are in. It looks like the majority of those who have responded use between 2 to 3 different types of guiding frameworks for their own materiality assessment. So I think that's a great transition over to Lene Serpa. As I mentioned earlier, Lene heads up the organizational engagement, trend spotting, and reporting on sustainability for AP Moller Maersk. She's been with Maersk for about 8 years and has 20 years of experience working in the CSR and corporate sustainability field. So Lene, I'll pass that over to you. I think the audience would love to hear about what is Maersk's materiality journey? How has that evolved over time, and where are you now?
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this webinar and this panel. I think it's such a timely topic around materiality. There's so many developments happening at the moment, which I'm sure we'll hear more about also from some of the other panelists and in the discussions. But yes, I'm happy to share also a little bit of our perspectives and some of the experiences that we've had and the approach that we've come to use at Maersk. So perhaps you could move to the next slide, please. As you already mentioned, Suzanne, Maersk is a global transport and logistics company. So we do have operations and activities in over 130 countries. And we also, being a part of, at the center of global trade and global value chains, you could say that, we're actually involved in or have some kind of connection to a really wide range of issues when it comes to sustainability. So materiality has been and continues to be an important way for us to navigate through all of that complexity and help us to understand what is important to us as a business, what's important to our stakeholders. The slide that you're seeing here is actually the outcome of the materiality assessment, the latest one that we've done in 2018, which is published in our sustainability report. And this reflects an approach to materiality that we've now been working on for 3 years. And just to put a little bit of background context to it, so as you'll see here, this is, I actually was one of the ones who to your poll just before, selected the option that we've developed our own framework, because this is our own approach, and it came about, I think around 2015, when at that time we had been using a more standard matrix approach for a few years in defining and reporting on material issues. But we were just increasingly finding that it was only really a tick box exercise, and it wasn't really driving much value to us. And importantly, it was also seeming to hide how issues were really important to us. So what we've done here is we've actually taken apart materiality into 3 dimensions, which and underlying each of these dimensions are assessments of how issues, as you can see here on the one hand, can constitute a risk to us as a business. So we assess that using enterprise risk management methodologies. And on the other hand, responsibilities, right? So the perhaps more classic sustainability view, where is it that Maersk may have a potential negative impact on society, on people, on the environment? And where is it our responsibility to mitigate this issue? So we use here particularly, for example, human rights, UN Guiding Principles assessment to help us make that kind of assessment. And finally, the more strategic question for us is on the shared value piece. Where is it that we really can make a significant difference to contributing to solving systemic challenges in society? So that's the shared value piece for us, and those are the areas that come out strongly and which are really the flagship areas of our sustainability strategy. So I think I'll stop here, but just to say, I mean, so for us, the important points here are really to say that having this more clear separation of the issues helps us really to make it more clear, both to ourselves, how are the issues important to us, what is it we need to do to manage them properly. So that's more clear to us, but it's also more clear to our stakeholders when we then report using this assessment.
Thank you, Lene. It seems, to your point, when trying to follow different types of frameworks and standards, companies do often feel it is a tick box exercise versus really a strategic, business process that's ongoing, that's dynamic, and that's guiding decision making. So how many issues would you say Maersk focused on when you started the materiality journey compared to the key issues that you've just highlighted now? Has there been a significant paring down?
Yes, there has been. And I would also say this is our global assessment. I noticed there was a question coming in. If I can just find it again here. So whale deaths or injuries caused by ships. And that's an example of certainly an issue which is something that we manage and work on within the context of our HSE, our health, safety, and environment work in Maersk. But because we're doing this particular materiality assessment at a global level, it is also, I would say, kind of elevated up to the issues which are most material for the entire group at a global level. So yes, I don't have the specific number of issues that are underlying, but certainly if you go down to the local level and the level of our individual businesses, there are much more detailed issues underlying the ones you're seeing here on this slide.
Absolutely. So it's important as well to consider, global strategy within the local context and ensure that can translate at all levels. Great. And we'll move on now to Yen-Pei. I think that's a good transition. Yen-Pei, thinking about Maersk and their materiality journey and really taking ownership of the process and wanting to be a process in-house. Is that a trend that you're seeing, generally speaking, when it comes to materiality and reporting? What are some of the trends that you see, and what are some of those must-haves that you see at the ACCA in terms of having a really robust materiality process in-house?
Yes. Hi, thank you very much. Very happy to be talking to you all here. I've been in particular, my focus has been on corporate reporting and integrated reporting specifically. Looking at integrated reports that are being produced around the world, we've certainly seen quite a lot of progress in terms of especially companies more proactively explaining their materiality process. So I'd be happy to share some examples with you very shortly. If I can take a step back, just to look at how different frameworks are generally defining materiality. Well, I think there are two maybe fundamental questions that need to be considered when we're thinking about materiality. The first is, who are we reporting to? And linked to that, for whom is what we call material information material? And if I may, I'll take you a little bit out of sort of non-financial reporting sphere to the concept of materiality within financial reporting, because I think that gives us a helpful background. So the IASB's conceptual framework defined materiality as information is material if omitting, misstating, or obscuring it could reasonably be expected to influence the decisions that the primary users of general-purpose financial reports make on the basis of those reports. And those primary users are investors and lenders and other creditors. So we can see here that, so the answer to the first question, who are we reporting to? They're providers of financial capital. The second question, interestingly, for whom is material information material? In financial reporting terms, there is an assumption that investors are sort of what is important for the company is for the company's financial performance is important for the investors. So what is material and needs to be reported on are information that are material to the reporting entity's financial position, performance, and the transactions that they undertake. And so going on from this into a little bit more of the sphere of non-financial reporting, we can see a similar approach being adopted in things like the integrated reporting framework, So in the integrated reporting framework, the audience is also primarily providers of financial capital, because the primary purpose of an integrated report is to explain to providers of financial capital how an organization creates value over time. So they've added this new dimension, which is value creation. And that expands the financial focus on financial profits beyond financial numbers to wider strategic objectives, things like your reputation, your customer goodwill, and supplier relationship with your employees, for example. But primarily the audience is still the investors, and there's still this assumption that what is good for the company is good for the investors. Now, in other reporting frameworks, such as the GRI standards, we see a slightly different perspective. So they take a more stakeholder perspective. So a topic is material if it has a significant impact on the company's stakeholders. So the audience becomes these other stakeholders besides financial providers of financial capital. And the assumption is that their interests may not necessarily be the same as the interests of the company. Now, there is still a tension in these two different approaches to materiality, and we see this tension coming across in regulatory approaches to mandating reporting requirements. Personally, I would favor this entity-specific approach, sort of looking through what is important to the company, what has the most significant impact on the business. And not because I don't think there is certainly a debate to be had about investor primacy, but with a more entity-specific approach, this enables a more natural loop back into the decision-making processes of the company. So if you're reporting, if what's material for your reporting is material for the company itself, then there's more chance that your reporting your materiality process outcomes will feed into the way you define your business's strategy and the way you manage your risk and so on.
And I think that brings up a very good point. You know, it seems materiality really is a concept that's been borrowed from the accounting and auditing domain. You know, so in that sense, it really does present a good transition to foster the integration of non-financials into mainstream business thinking and decision-making, right? Because it's financially relevant, it's familiar to investors and to auditors as well. You know, so in that respect, I think it's interesting to see how this concept was sort of borrowed from that domain, but also taking on a life of its own, and how it's really evolving to become more of an integrated concept in light of especially, you know, more recent regulatory and policy changes that we see, for instance, with the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, with the EU non-financial reporting directive. And I know, Andreas, that's some of the things that you'll touch upon there. So Yen-Pei, just to keep that evolution discussion going, what are, you know, to end off with, what are some of, you know, the key practices, you would say the top 3 practices for companies to keep in mind when doing materiality analysis on ESG issues?
Yes, indeed. In terms of the materiality analysis, I think it's as I said, there's so many different approaches in there, and each company may find different approaches work for them. Generally, there is, as you can see here in this example, actually, it's very helpful for when you're reading a report to see how the materiality analysis has actually been worked through. And this, from the South African company Eskom, is quite a typical process, I suppose. They've sort of internally generated a list of material issues, and they engage with stakeholders. And importantly, at the end, there's a check back to group management and the board to ensure that there is that strategic alignment. There are other processes that I've seen that follow a similar process, but where the board's involvement is actually at the beginning. So the board comes up with the list of material issues as part of their ongoing board discussions, and then these are then tested with the stakeholders. I think that seems to be the board's involvement is particularly important. Going back to reporting, as we've got this example here, I think it's really helpful generally to explain what materiality means for an organization. So that's what we've got here. They're making clear that material issues are those that have the potential to substantially impact their commercial viability, social relevance, or relationships with stakeholders, rather similar to what we've seen from Maersk in a way.
Absolutely. I think that's quite useful. Sorry not to interrupt, but to keep that concept going, I think right there you brought up a very good point as well. There's sort of these two perspectives. You can have a very stakeholder-oriented approach where you think about, from a company perspective, what are your impacts on different stakeholders, whether that be the environment, the investors, employees. But also you can have the perspective of what are the impacts of the environment, society, broader stakeholders on the company itself.
Yeah.
More and more we're seeing those two perspectives integrated. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next polling question. So we'll get back to the audience before we get over to you, Andreas, to talk about what we see now in the landscape. For the second poll, it's really about time. So how often do you actually undertake a materiality assessment in your organization? I think that's one of the key debated issues right now is there's more expectation from investors and regulators that this process is dynamic. It's ongoing, as you spoke about, Lene. So I'll give you a moment to answer the poll there. It should have popped up on your screen. So you have 4 options in terms of how often you undertake a materiality analysis. Okay. So it looks like out of the majority who voted, conduct a materiality analysis or assessment once a year or more frequently. Whereas we saw, I think, in the past, the trend was every 2 years, maybe every 3 years or more. So that's encouraging to see, since that does line up with the expectations we're seeing from different stakeholders. So Andreas, let's pass it on to you. As I had mentioned earlier, Andreas is a professor of operational risk, banking and finance at the University College of Dublin. But also, Andreas, you serve the EU's Technical Expert Group for Sustainable Finance, and you're the only individual academic member. And I believe that when we spoke, you said you really see yourself as a financial data scientist working towards the vision of a conflict-free capitalism, which is a unique and interesting way to see it. So, with that in mind, what do you expect to see moving forward in terms of materiality processes and how companies embrace this?
Yeah, so I'd like to make 3 times 3 points. So first of all, as an introduction, I'm a professor at UCD. I also direct the MSc in Renewable Energy and Environmental Finance here. And I'm also a member of the TEC, and it's important to highlight that TEC has 35 members. 30 members are corporations or entities. So it means if the individual gets fired, someone else replaces the individual. It's the individual members that are there, the organizational members. 1 member represents all pension funds. That's Brenda Kramer from PGGM. And then there's 4 members in individual capacity, which means that Sean Kidney, myself, Paolo, and I'm forgetting one, can speak significantly more freely because we are speaking on our own behalf rather than our organizational behalf. So then conceptually, I'd like to start off with the entity-specific approach that was just discussed in TCFD. So TCFD is equivalent to a high-level expert group. As you will have noticed when you're engaged with it, it's not really a in-depth technical guidance, which makes it quite hard to do the actual aligned reporting. So some of the questions that are the next step following TCFD, and don't get me wrong, this is not at all a criticism of the efforts. The efforts are great. We just have to move forward, is, for instance, entity specific. A lot of companies do not report accurate scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions data, let alone scope 2 or even scope 3. So with the missing data or the data that is clearly inaccurate, it has to be estimated based on corporate operations. When you look at such estimations, TCFD recommends to scale it all by revenue. This may work for some of the sectors, and this may work for some of the more critical sectors. But when we academically look at it across all companies, companies that are more in the services space are much more driven by employees. So looking at data morale itself, I guess you would be more driven by employee numbers in terms of your own greenhouse gas emissions. Many other service providers would be kind of the same. And so in essence, it is important, for instance, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, to say, are they driven by production? Are they driven by employees? Are they driven by revenues, total assets, market cap, and so forth? And then, of course, realistically, is the data actually available? So we have to go in more detail. The next thing that I would like to make conceptually, so my second conceptual point, is that in 1992, there was a Rio Earth Summit, and they made a very important point in paragraph 15, which is the precautionary principle. And very simply said, the precautionary principle, I think, is of paramount importance for all of your corporate reporting. It is, if you're in doubt, err on the side of the planet, not on the side of the company. So basically, do not let your financial conflict of interest get in the way of accurate reporting. And sadly, when we look at the data, the majority of companies are acting on behalf of the company, not on behalf of the planet. So if I can encourage one thing, it is follow the precautionary principle. If you have discretionary and doubtful information in your reporting, and realistically you'll have that very often and for good reasons, right? You might have offices in a remote place where the landlord is not interested in any carbon footprint of the building, for instance, so there's no way to report these numbers properly. So then please apply the precautionary principle. And then coming straight into the actual tech work, when you read the disclosure group's draft report on corporate disclosure, and I'll come to investor disclosure later. So corporate disclosure, the non-financial reporting directive, sadly, it is still not mandatory. So this remains voluntary. The companies can do whatever they like. They can look at the guidance. They do not need to look at the guidance. And I can tell you this is still not mandatory because there isn't a lot of people interested. It's just not enough yet from the European political process. And there is two types of materiality. So there is a stakeholder materiality, kind of the GRI logic that the son just mentioned. And then there is the SEC materiality, which is only what affects your bottom line. I clearly do not call that investor materiality because the SEC materiality by now is not equivalent anymore with investor materiality. There is so many responsible investors out there that are very frustrated with the limited accounting materiality that actually does not really impact shareholder value. Most of the accounting factors are efficient in terms of market performance when you struggle them as an investing process. And so we really have to look, that we have to have a dual materiality. So what is important for the company's operations, but also what are the impacts a company has on the planet. To make a theoretical academic example, if a very, very large Chinese bank happened to end up with an Australian coal mine that was a significant polluting operation, but it's not really affecting the bottom line of a big Chinese bank, well, is that material or not? From an accounting standard, it wouldn't be because it's just a too small part of the operation. From a planetary standard, it is clearly material because it pollutes a lot in terms of coal. So then coming to the three technical points that I'd like to make, and I follow on directly from the previous speaker in terms of materiality as is defined in an accounting sense. So Yen-Pei said, and Yen-Pei, correct me if I misunderstood you, said it's omitting, mistaking, or obscuring the information, correct? And so if that is not the case, then if you omitted, mistaken, or obscured it, and the investor would change their behavior, then it is an issue for materiality. So, and it's all for the providers of financial capital, which I actually fully agree with. That's an important point. It is for the providers of financial capital, not for the salesman of financial capital. So it's for the buy side, not for your investment banker. It's for your pension fund, your asset manager, not for those people that sell financial capital and just try to impress. So when you look at what the investors really want, and you can look at those investors in the tech, and you can look at those investors that are themselves having to report now in a mandatory fashion, they would like to align with the 2-degree scenario. Some of them even with the 1.5 degree scenario. So we have to develop in the tech Paris-aligned indexes. We have to develop an EU climate transition index because the pension funds are asking for this. And I spoke to 24 UK pension funds in one meeting last week as the only non-pension fund in there, and they clearly are looking for such kind of alignment. So to get that alignment, we really have to praise the dual materiality, and every information that is relevant for climate, meaning every emission, needs to be accounted for. Otherwise, investors won't be able to do a proper carbon footprint. It's not possible if everybody just incompletely reports their greenhouse gas emissions. And so it is important that the materiality is everything that the investors want, and that the investors are us, not the investment banker. The investment banker is sell side. It's a salesman of financial stuff. It's not in any way the provider of the financial capital. The provider of the financial capital is the pension fund, the insurance, the high net worth individual, and then individual others. But it's largely pension funds and insurances that are the providers of financial capital, and that are either funding or not funding. So from a corporate perspective, the most important is your bond investor, because they are not willing to refinance you, then you have an issue. And if they are increasingly willing to refinance you because you issue a green bond which they appreciate, you're massively oversubscribed, then you have a great opportunity. So then coming to the exact tech work, to just highlight some of the developments, and of course they're ongoing, so draft reports will come out, and I'm happy to take further questions, and you contact me on LinkedIn with any further questions you like. So when you look into the disclosure group of the tech, then it is not only noteworthy that there's dual materiality, and by the way, we do roadshows around the world, so we've talked about this in Beijing, in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, I talked about it last week in Riga. So it is also noteworthy that when it comes, for instance, to greenhouse gas emissions reporting, it is expected that companies report two things: those greenhouse gas emissions they are able to collect, and those that they had to estimate, because we understand realistically no one, or very, very few companies, we think 21, can collect all the emissions. Everybody else will have to estimate a remaining percentage, and if that is not explicitly stated, it simply seems that it's forgotten, which means it's not going to be 100% and maybe just 90% Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions. And while for the company this might not appear as a big problem as long as it's big enough, it is a big problem for the investors that follow TCFD, want to compute their carbon footprints. If they don't even have accurate Scope 1 emissions, how are they ever going to get anywhere close to a carbon footprint? And I'm not by any way saying that a company that reported 87% of the greenhouse gas emissions and made a footnote is doing badly. No, they're doing pretty good. They should just estimate the last 30%. The companies globally that are doing badly and that have the biggest black numbers when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions are your likes of Rosneft, your likes of Eurasia Drill, your likes of Gazprom, is Russian, and Saudi Aramco, of course, and Saudi Arabian and partially Chinese polluting firms that are the actual global problem. So, and then to my final point, which I'd like to make, and I think that's also important for all the corporate representatives. So since the February 25th, 2019, so we're not even 3 months away, investor disclosure on ESG is mandatory. The European Parliament and the European Council, and of course the Commission organizing everything, have made ESG disclosure for investors mandatory. Now we're in the bizarre situation that corporate social responsibility disclosures for companies is there for 30 years. I personally did my PhD at St. Andrews, where there's a big CSR center, but it is still not mandatory. While investor ESG disclosure, which is only there for 10 years or 15 years, is already mandatory. So you can ask yourself why that is the case. I think there's clear suspects why that is the case. But this also, of course, will mean that once your investors get in the routine of disclosing everything mandatorily themselves, they will ask much more from the companies than they do now. And so to come back to TCFD, it is, in the European context, TCFD is equivalent to a high-level expert group, giving us the ambitions, but not really saying what we do. The technical expert group is a how. That's where academics like me are in that to basically go into detail of how we actually do it. And TCFD is high level, and the biggest achievement of TCFD, and there's a lot of achievements, and there's a lot more work to do. So Curtis would himself openly say, yes, we need to understand if revenue is the best scaler everywhere. So the biggest achievement is that it made the investors look into the data. And when you read the TCFD reports of the Environmental Agency Pension Fund, or AP2, you realize that there is a degree of surprise of how bad the data actually was on average, which seemed quite good when you just looked at the report. And so we really have to put this into context and say, investors are getting there. They have mandatory ESG disclosure now, which corporations own, and they will have indexes that align with the Paris Agreement, or that are at least some sort of EU transition index inspired by the IPCC. So there's a lot of good news out there. They're demanding in dual materiality, not only what is important for your bottom line, but also what you are important for the planet, in particular the Paris alignment. And not necessarily all the companies are getting there yet, but I do absolutely state that those that are most off are Saudi Arabian and Russian companies. I hope that was informative, and I take any questions, or of course any discussion. I also have some questions, if I may.
Yeah, Andreas, thank you. That was very informative. And this idea of dual materiality, I think, is increasingly important for companies. Whether or not they're working in the financial industry or other industries operating out of the U.S. Or Europe, and Lene, that gives me a question that I actually have for you in light of these, regulatory and policy changes that are happening in the external landscape. What do you see? Do you see these as a driver to help make the business case internally as to why you need to connect the materiality process to other business processes in-house? Are these helpful to you in your role?
Yes, absolutely. They are. Of course, we're also following them closely. To Elisa, I completely agree that things are really moving very, very fast at the moment, not least at the EU level, and in this whole investment space. But yes, I think it is providing us with a more clear business case that we can use, that we are using internally to strengthen the connection between what we do on sustainability and how this impacts our business. So when our investors, as we are really seeing now, just over the last few years in particular, when our investors are asking the questions, and as we have begun to say a little provocatively, perhaps, that investors seem to be the new NGOs for us, right? They're the ones who are pushing companies now on the sustainability agenda. But they are pushing us in a way that is different to what we've been used to, right? I mean, they're pushing us to come up with much more concrete data points. As Andreas also was mentioning, the points about the full scope of CO2 inventories, etc. Much more detailed data expectations. So it is a new field for us that we're moving into, which is going to pose some new challenges. But I absolutely agree. It's going to it is needed, right? Because we need to be able to work collectively towards these goals around living up to the Paris Agreement. Not only, I would say, the 2-degree scenario, but even the 1.5, right?
Mm. Yeah, and that actually brings up a good question. Thinking about how companies actually go about the identification process, right? Identifying what are the key stakeholder expectations, what are the key issues on which they want to focus. Traditionally, I think many companies rely on manual desktop research as well as a survey approach, right? So actually sending out a survey to key stakeholders. How much value do you think that survey-only approach serves now in light of the growing scrutiny on the process and the data around your materiality?
So I don't think it provides much value at all. I think it's an approach that in the past perhaps was useful or to those companies who would like to have a really strong anchoring in the stakeholder side, right? Who for various reasons would need documentation that they have been asking stakeholders what issues are more important to them. That might, for example, be really important in a local context. If you're asking stakeholders specifically, let's say, we have these options to do one of 3 things, which are the most important ones for us to work on. In that sense, I could see it working. But I have also personally often seen, surveys where we may also, as Maersk, be asked as a supplier to global companies to participate in their materiality assessments. And so if I'm presented with a survey, which asks me to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, which is more important, climate change or, solving poverty, or, this just, I think, add any kind of valuable information to the companies who receive this type of information, I think.
Yeah, it's a fair point. It leads to, a limited view, perhaps a subjective view, depends on who's responding, how they're responding. But actually, just to keep the conversation going, would also love to hear from you, the audience, one more time, and thinking about this connection between the materiality assessment and the expectations that this becomes a much more robust process, more in line with traditional financial accounting standards. Do you think that the results of your materiality assessment are fully integrated into your corporate strategy? So we have a poll for you to respond to, which asks you that question, 3 simple answers that you can provide. Either yes, you do think the results are fully integrated, no, they're not fully integrated, or partly, not to the extent that it could have been, perhaps the extent that you would like it to be. So let's see, let's hear from you. All right, interesting. So majority of those who are responding are saying that the results are partly integrated into their corporate strategy, not to the extent that it could have been. So, it seems we're all on this journey together, right, towards integration. So with that in mind, actually, we have a follow-up question to this poll then, one more poll, the last poll for today. What would you say are the reasons, in your opinion, for not fully integrating the results of your materiality assessment to their full capacity? We put up a few responses here or options here that you can respond to. If you don't see an option here that resonates, please respond other, and then you can specify in the chat box. But essentially, we're wondering, is it a lack of board buy-in? Is materiality really just seen as a reporting exercise? Are there silos internally? So the sustainability team or ones responsible for the materiality assessment operate in a silo? Do you find that the materiality process is subjective? And then other, so you can specify. Okay, so it looks like the majority is between 1, there's a silo, and 2, it's just a reporting exercise, and then also there were some others mentioned as well. Great. Okay, thank you for responding to that. So obviously questions can keep popping in. I see some of you are using the chat or the Q&A box. Please ask your questions as we go. It's really about an open discussion right now with you, the audience. But just looking at some of the questions that are coming through, there was a question actually responding to the survey discussion we had, Lene. So I'll leave it as an open question to all panelists. What method should be used for identifying material issues if the survey method does actually not provide valuable insights?
If I may, I don't do the materiality assessments, of course, myself, but having seen some of what's come through in the reports and talking to people, it's worth saying there may not be one single approach. It depends on the key stakeholders that you are looking at, and for example, it's for your customers. If you are really joining up across your organization, as integrated reporting people would say, doing integrated thinking, then you get a lot of valuable insights through to your customer services team, for example, with customers regularly getting in touch on a daily basis about what concerns them. All of that insight could be then aggregated and used to inform the materiality assessment process as well. Similarly, I've been talking about sort of board involvement, but in an organization, the views of employees are just as important. And so the internal processes of regularly engaging with your employees, getting that sort of bottom-up voices coming through to inform management, those processes are equally important as well.
Any follow-up to that, Andreas or Lene? Okay.
Sorry.
So
I was typing, sorry. So I didn't hear, but I just wanted to say, I think, as you can see also, I mean, it is important to clarify, I'm of course not against stakeholder engagement as such, and that is important. What I was saying before was in response to the specific question about surveys as a tool.
Right. And relying exclusively on that as the approach to capture stakeholder opinions.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
Andreas, to your point earlier, you know, in terms of the rigor that's expected now of companies in their materiality process, you know, what would you say are some of the do's or don'ts of materiality moving forward in light of the changing policy landscape that we see?
Yeah, so a couple of points. First of all, I don't think surveys are generally a very clever idea in 2019 because they're just too cumbersome and
Andreas, I think we've lost your audio, unless that's just on my side.
Can I hear it? I can hear everybody well. Oh, your connection is unstable.
Okay, now we can hear you again.
Okay, all right, sorry.
No problem.
So I repeat, so I said I think surveys are generally in 2019 losing out to big data. They're too infrequent and way too costly compared to data science approaches. To come to the second poll question, if I may voice a very, very slight criticism, I think the main reason is not the board buy-in. The board is normally the monitoring. They are quite interested in the risk. It's the top executives that are the problem. So when we look at shareholder engagement, shareholder engagement works by far the best if you work with the respective departments, so the sustainability, IR, or some other risk department, and the board. But the ones you normally need to corner is actually your executive management team. And directly, I'm very proud to be on a panel that has a good gender balance, and if it's off, then the other way off. So when you actually look at gender diversity on boards, that's the red herring compared to the real problem, which is gender diversity in top executives. And no one even has data on that. So that also means directly, to follow up any question that might come, I'm very much in favor of gender diversity on boards, but I'm even more so in favor of gender diversity among the top executives. And I do think companies should report both ratios, and they don't do it. They don't report the top executive, they only report the board side. So essentially, that comes to the general recommendations, which is, in my view, the first point is treat it as a scientific exercise. If anyhow possible, make sure that you report the sustainability information into your COO, or if that doesn't work, the CFO, but into someone that treats it as an actual business process that is repeating. They need to be accurate. If you happen to report into marketing or into AR or into communications, then that is already a very, very bad start. We have to say that from a scientific perspective. So if you treat it as a scientific exercise and you show a goodwill to honesty, that is by far the best thing I think everybody can do. Nowadays, companies are, with many questions, completely overwhelmed. Let's put it that way. I would like to reference the Yahoo example. When Yahoo was acquired by Verizon, they had to admit that they had a massive data breach. They admitted 500 million. 6 months later, they admitted 1 billion and a more complicated data brief. And at the very end of the process, they had to admit that virtually everyone was breached. So that's just embarrassing. And they should have done something about this way earlier, and in a way more honest way, that they control the discussion by being honest and having full insight into this. And so in essence, one of the things we're also seeing with both non-financial reporting, ESG reporting, and data science being massively on the advance is that the role of the COO in organizations gets much more important. If the COO actually gets to do something and puts her or his weight behind it, it is likely to work and is likely to make a difference. And the CFO likewise, but the CFO is more financial. The COO is real data processing and processes. And so that is where I believe the organization of the future is run from the CEO and the CFO's department. It is less about the claims that people increasingly just question anyway, maybe not in public, but in private, because trust has got lost, certainly since the recent political elections in 2016. So people question virtually everything, and it needs to really function and work, which also means the first thing to do is spend time to actually make it good and then start talking about it. Don't start talking when you haven't even finished it.
It brings up two good points, Andreas, that you mentioned there. I would like to touch on as we start to bring this conversation to a close. Also seeing some questions come in, in terms of how do you see materiality evolving in the future? You mentioned big data, right? So the use of big data, the use of technology to help support materiality processes. But also, I think you brought up a key point in terms of having the COO as well as the CFO more engaged on this process. Is the expectations are really that companies have this process in-house, right? That it's not done on a once-a-year basis as a project, relying exclusively, on external support, but really that you have the expertise in-house. So thinking about the evolution of materiality and the evolution of big data and technology, Lene, do you see that these are tools that can also be helpful to you from a materiality perspective?
Yes, I think they certainly can. Perhaps most importantly from that perspective of picking up what issues are out there and how they are important in various parts of the world to what stakeholder groups. But I think that we would then apply some of those more, let's say, in-house or our own methods of analyzing the issues once we have the input from various more digital perhaps tools or techniques. At least we have not been able to find that one silver bullet which would come up with the be able to crunch all issues from all angles and then come up with the answers to us. But clearly various big data and tools will be important to broaden our view on what issues are important.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? It's about how can we use technology and big data to help provide a more comprehensive view of the external landscape, ensure that you capture different types of stakeholder opinions, like your peers, your employees, regulators, policymakers, media. Absolutely. All right. So with that, we have about a minute remaining. I think we've gotten to most of the questions from the audience. But let's end with one final question, which is kind of broad, but I'll give each of the panelists a minute to respond to that. What is the future of disclosure, in your opinion, the future of ESG disclosure? And I'll start with you, Yen-Pei.
Right. Yes, we've talked about the lots of disparate demands for information. Andreas touched upon the loss of public trust. So I think there are more and more pressures in disclosure. And my hope is that in this fragmented landscape, forward-looking businesses would be driven to really use the reporting process to inform their strategic decisions, and only when the sort of inside and the outside are aligned can we really have a reporting process that's meaningful for the company and also credible in the eyes of investors and other stakeholders as well.
So materiality beyond reporting.
Yeah.
Great. And Andreas?
So I think the future of disclosure, as much as disclosure is not directly replaced by external KPIs of unfiltered information, which rating agencies like MSCI are pushing, is what Shell is actually doing when they disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. They have an external group that checks them, that have their personal name on it. So as opposed to a top auditing and accounting firm, which is just the partners are protected by the corporate brand. So there is a bigger incentive to check accurately. All the data is actually downloadable and investigatable by any academic or student. So that level of greenhouse gas reporting is unprecedented in their sector. And if I may say that in case any Equinor representatives are on the call, Equinor probably spends 90% of its marketing budget on green, and certainly everyone in Brussels is Equinor in every airport gangway. But when you look at the disclosure of CapEx, which for the oil and gas sector is the most important, to disclose how much of your CapEx is actually in renewable and how much of your CapEx is not, BP is now the one going first. So we hope that Equinor is going to follow quickly and say how much of the CapEx is SDG aligned.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, having a fully auditable data trail, having real data behind the disclosure, not having it be a marketing exercise. Great. And then Lene, you're in the hot seat, I guess, because you're leading these processes in-house. What would you say?
Yeah, so I think I would say that building on what the other panelists have already said, that I hope the future of disclosure is that there will really be a focus on data issues and indicators of what is actually moving the needle, what is driving transformational change to the point, for example, also about Shell's reporting, and because I think that's where we need to get to, right? So we need more science-based context. We need a more clear picture of of that context that we should be striving for, and how that will then provide us with a way of demonstrating how what we're doing is contributing in a positive way.
Excellent. So having a more science-based approach, having something that's forward-looking as well, not just backward-looking, as reporting materiality tend to be. Great. Well, I realize we've gone a little bit over. I know the panelists do have to run to other meetings, so thank you everyone for your participation and engagement. I see some unanswered questions that we haven't got to, so we'll respond to those next. We also have additional resources that we can share with you that speak to materiality processes and how these are evolving, some Datamoran publications, but also recently there was a great publication from NASDAQ on ESG reporting guidelines, so we'll distribute some of those for you as well. Thank you to our panelists today, to Lene, Yen-Pei, and Andreas. Very dynamic discussion. I think we could go on for another hour at least, but we'll save that for another time. So thank you to all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.